Hello everyone. Welcome back to Toronto IR Seminar. Today we are glad to have Marija Popović to give a talk on active sensing with intelligent robots, mapping and planning for robot autonomy. So Marija is a junior research group leader at University of Bonn and a cluster of excellence PhenoRob. Before starting in Bonn, she was a postdoctoral research associate at the Smart Robotics Lab at Imperial College London. She received her PhD titled Environmental Mapping and Informative Task Planning for UAV-based active sensing from the Autonomous Systems Lab at UTH Zurich, and did her master in engineering in integrated mechanical and electronical engineering at the University of Bath. Her research centers around developing algorithms that enable intelligent robotic decision-making, including planning, coordination, environmental mapping, and computer vision. Feel free to take away, Marija, and thanks again for giving the talk.
Great, thanks for this nice introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Marija, and I'm happy to be here today to present our recent work on active sensing with intelligent robots that we do within our cluster of excellence. So on the first slide, I actually prepared an introduction of myself, which is exactly what we just heard for the new faces that I see here. So yes, as we mentioned, I'm a junior research group leader in PhenoRob. Before that, I lived in many different places, and I was born in Serbia, so I'm quite international. And especially thanks to Igor for having me here. We met during my PhD in ETH Zurich. So first of all, what is actually the cluster of excellence PhenoRob? Well, just to give a bit of an introduction as to how we work and about our institute. So since 2019, the University of Bonn does research together with the Institut Forschungszentrum Jülich in this cluster of excellence, robotics and phenotyping for sustainable crop production. And basically the goal is that we acknowledge that the demand for food, feed, and fiber is increasing. At the same time, we're faced with challenges such as climate change, the reduction of arable land, and labor shortages. And so we want to try to increase crop production in a sustainable way with the help of robotics and modern technologies. And specifically in PhenoRob, we focus on precision agriculture. So we want to observe, analyze, and understand specific plants so that we can treat them and thus reduce environmental footprint. So this is the general aim of the cluster of excellence. And the research is organized into 6 so-called core projects, which we can see on the next slide. So altogether, there is about 150 people working in the cluster spread across these core projects. So the cluster is very interdisciplinary. As we can see, there's a variety of areas of study, including computer vision and crop science, agricultural economics, and robotics. So we're working on robotics, and here our research group is centered in core project 4, which is autonomous in-field intervention using agricultural robots and digital avatars. So what I'm going to present today in the presentation is the work of our junior research group, which is led by me, and our team consists of 2 PhD students, Liren and Julius, who are also here on the call if they managed to get in. And we started working together in March last year. So the content of this presentation is based on the work that we have done together so far and their projects. And hopefully they'll also be able to participate in the discussions. So that's just a short intro about us and our work setup. And now we can get into our talk, which is about robot autonomy. So as we know, robots are intelligent devices. We can program them and we can design them to perform different tasks. So let's start on a very high level by looking at the spectrum of autonomy in robotics and think about how robots can contribute to the society performing different tasks on different levels. So if we start from the bottom, we can think about a very base level of everything being done by humans in a fully manual way. So here we see examples of people inspecting bridges manually, or performing different operations, picking fruits, weeding on the farm at this base level where robots are not present. Now, moving up the scale, on the second level, humans start to use robots, but in a manually controlled way, so that they replace conventional machines and the devices that we have. So, for example, we can think about familiar scenarios such as flying UAVs with a joystick or an app interface in order to collect some data and analyze it later. And this is what most of us are familiar with and the way that we're habituated to using robotics currently. But in our research, we target a level of autonomy above that. So rather than using robots to replace current methods, we want to challenge these existing approaches and exploit the fact that we have robots that we can actually program to make autonomous, informed decisions and even cooperate together. So this way, robots will operate fully autonomously, making decisions on their own efficiently, autonomously, and with minimal human intervention. But in order to realize this nice vision, we need to design new robotic algorithms that allow robots to reason about their environments and make decisions autonomously. So what type of decisions could there be? So in this slide, we see examples of decision-making scenarios in agriculture, where the robots need to interpret the state of the environment and make the best possible choices about what to do next. So, for example, if we think of a simple sensing scenario where the robot has a camera, it needs to decide where to take the next images. Does it make sense to explore the field? Or if it has found something, to focus on taking more measurements there to look more closely and study this particular spot. And further, we can also have a cooperation between robots where one robot has inspected something and communicates, for example, to this ground robot to inspect the targeted area with more fine-grained measurements on the ground level. So this is a very big question that we're trying to answer in the research. So let's consider a simple example, just monitoring a field using a UAV that can fly at different altitudes, as we can see here in a top-down view. So in many monitoring scenarios, we have such an area or volume of interest, and we want to survey specific characteristics. We want to measure something using a sensor. Following a conventional approach, we can use, for example, an app to create a lawnmower path to cover the field at a fixed altitude, given the limited battery life of the UAV that determines its flight time. So this strategy is very familiar, it's simple and fast, and also available in most commercial products. But what if there are certain parts of this field then we need to inspect more closely? So one can think about, for example, some anomalies that can be found in the field, weeds that we want to inspect carefully, or plant diseases to figure out what's going on in greater detail. And so if we use this lawnmower type planning, the major drawback is that the entire environment is mapped with a constant resolution limited by this initial trajectory. And because we don't know where these interesting regions are in advance, we can't focus on collecting more measurements and improving map accuracy in a targeted way. Instead, we waste the energy on mapping exhaustively without making full use of the UAV battery life. So, but if we use autonomous decision-making, or in this case, active sensing, we can perform more efficient and targeted monitoring, allowing the robot to decide where to go next. In this way, we can adaptively focus on collecting higher quality data in more interesting areas, leading to much better use of the limited battery life. However, if we want to solve this problem, we encounter several practical challenges. So first, we need to decide how can we model this environment, and how can we measure the usefulness of potential measurements in the future with respect to this map representation. So how can we evaluate how useful potential future actions are? And secondly, we need a planning algorithm that needs to balance between exploring an initially unknown or partially known environment and exploiting information as it is collected. And also, importantly, if we want to replan from time to time using our planning algorithm in the environment, we need to make sure that the algorithm is computationally fast enough to be run on board and online platforms with computational constraints. And an important part of both the mapping and planning processes is that we need a reliable model of the robot sensor. So we need to use this model to update the field map with new measurements, and we can also use it to predict how useful future measurements are when deciding where to go next. So to make this more concrete, in aerial imaging, an important trade-off arises from the fact that real sensing data, for example, obtained using a camera, is noisy and often at different resolutions. So if we think about mapping a field, we can see the same point on the field from different altitudes, and we need to account for the fact that the sensor spatial resolution degrades when we increase coverage or when we see more of the field. And this aspect makes decision-making very complex and computationally challenging to solve. So addressing these three core research challenges is the focus of our research group. So we want to develop algorithms that enable decision-making in uncertain 3D environments on computationally limited systems. In this way, we hope to push the boundaries of autonomous operation and extend that scale of robot autonomy that we saw in the introduction. So in this talk, to make the discussion manageable within the time that we have, we want to focus specifically on this problem of active sensing, where we have a UAV and we want to monitor a given terrain about it. We need to decide where to look next to get the best views and the most useful views given an initially unknown environment. And we formulated this problem in the context of PhenoRob. So how can we do this? Let's try to connect these elements together and try to build the structure of an autonomous system. So say that we have the robot equipped with a sensor, for example, a depth or a multispectral camera from which measurements can be extracted that tells us what the robot is seeing. We can use these measurements to build a map of the environment of interest, for example, the field. In here, we might also have prior information from previous missions that we want to add into the map. Otherwise, we can just assume an unknown environment that we need to explore. And during a mission, we have a planning unit that uses these environmental maps built online to optimize trajectories based on a given objective. So for example, we want to collect data in an efficient way. So a key ingredient that enables us to do active sensing here is this so-called utility function in the pink, which is used to reflect the aim of the mission. So what we want the robot to sense or to do. We use this utility function to measure how valuable future actions are. So for example, if we want to inspect weeds on a field in a targeted way, we can design the utility function that captures the fact that the gain in information or the value is higher when we position the robot to collect new images in places where we think the weeds are. Now, during the presentation, I'll discuss some of the approaches for mapping and planning that we propose within this framework. And in between these two sections of the presentation, we'll have a quick break and there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. So starting with the mapping part, let's try to zoom into this module and see how can we solve this problem, focusing on that application of UAV-based terrain monitoring for active sensing. So what are some of the specific challenges associated with mapping field environments? Well, typically we have very large field areas that we want to monitor and robot cameras that provide very high resolution images. Also, if we're doing some kind of processing on the images, we need a map that caters for the uncertainty in the measurements obtained from the raw data. So in this example, we see a simple example of crop weed segmentation, where the red are the weeds that were detected using a neural network from the onboard camera, and the green are the crops. So there might be some uncertainty in this segmentations that we want to capture when we construct the map representation. Another aspect is the fact that our measurements might also have spatial correlations. So if we look closely at the crop weed segmentation image, we can see that the weeds cluster together, reflecting how the plants actually grow together. And we want a map representation that captures this type of natural behavior. So in mapping, the main challenge is how can we incorporate all these elements in a single probabilistic compact map representation that we can use for planning and also update online when we receive new measurements during the mission. So I want to introduce a method for solving this problem that is based on Liren's recent work. So we designed an adaptive resolution mapping strategy suitable for mapping fields in UAV-based terrain monitoring scenarios. And this approach is suitable for mapping continuous variables on the terrain, for example, temperature or humidity or vegetation cover, so variables which vary continuously. And as we said, the main challenge here is how can we fuse a dense visual imagery from a camera in a single map in a computationally efficient way, while also accounting for the uncertainty. So our approach is based on Gaussian process or GP fusion. So basically, we use a machine learning technique, the Gaussian process, to encode the spatial correlations in the ground distribution in a probabilistic way. So essentially, we apply Gaussian process regression at the beginning to capture the spatial correlations in the field. And then when we receive new noisy measurements from the sensor, we apply a Bayesian fusion update by projecting the camera image on the terrain and updating those cells that we see in the map there. So the key part of this GP fusion is that we use the GP as a prior for capturing these correlations. And then with the fixed map resolution, we can use Bayesian fusion to update the map in a computationally efficient way. So the advantages of doing this in this way is that, as we said, because the prior is at a fixed resolution, computational intensity is rather low. So the mapping approach is fast. In fact, we get fast constant time updates, which are important for online applications. And this is in contrast to standard GP regression, if some are familiar with this, which essentially pools all the measurements that are acquired and then applies regression to infer the values at unknown locations. Instead, we do the regression step only once at the beginning of the mission and then do the recursive data fusion. And the second advantage is that this strategy supports fusion with uncertain sensors that are potentially at different resolutions. And this allows us to use heterogeneous sensors, which is relevant for mapping on UAVs, which may have different types of sensors. So the key question is that we ask in Liren's work is, can we adapt the resolution of the map to conserve memory and accelerate computation time? So motivation is similar to what is done in Octomap, for example, which uses the octree structure to achieve efficient mapping in clustered environments by grouping the parts of the space that are free and the unoccupied. So we try to compress the information of the map in areas that are homogeneous in order to accelerate mapping. But in our problem, we can't do something similar in a straightforward way because our approach is based on GP fusion. And the changing the map resolution in this setup is difficult because the map is correlated, as we said in the beginning. So we want to preserve these spatial correlations between cells in a theoretically sound and efficient way. So looking at the example, when we group the information of multiple smaller cells in the dark blue together into a larger one in the light blue, we want to make sure that both the values as well as the correlations between the cells are handled properly through the GP mean and covariance of our map. So to address this, in our mapping approach, we introduce an integral kernel function to encode the spatial correlations of the continuous field map. So to understand what an integral kernel is, we can think about what is a normal kernel function in machine learning. So a kernel function tells us something about how 2 points in our model are related based on the covariance. In a similar way, the integral kernel function tells us how areas in the model are related. So moving from points to areas. And this way we can apply the integral kernel for different areas in the map to calculate their relationship in a similar way through the covariance. And the use of the integral kernel in our mapping approach can merge cells into larger areas to save memory and computation time for online mapping. So if we have multiple cells that are similar and we want to compress, we can apply the integral kernel to group them together while maintaining the spatial correlations. This will hopefully become more concrete when we look at an example. So on the left, we can see its example experimental setup in simulation using a UAV in a terrain monitoring scenario. And the second plot, we can see the ground truth of a continuous field that the UAV is monitoring, where the yellower shades indicate higher values. For example, these could be high temperature or high biomass that we want to inspect more closely. On the right, we can see the result obtained by mapping using our approach with a set of top-down measurements obtained with the UAV camera. So if we look very carefully at the grid structure of the final map, one can see that we achieve high resolution mapping in the yellower, more interesting areas that we want to focus on, and low resolution mapping in the bluer, less interesting areas. And essentially, we can compress the information in these areas of less interest, the bluer areas, thus saving mapping time and memory. And in the paper, which is referenced at the bottom, we also show this quantitatively by comparing against standard GPU regression, as well as different mapping baselines with fixed resolution approaches. So if you're interested in more details and numbers and a big table, you can look at the reference there. We also tested the approach using surface temperature data to validate the performance in real-world scenarios. So on the top, we can see a setup showing a UAV over a crop field in Jülich, which is near Bonn. The UAV has a thermal camera on board, which is used to collect surface temperature of the field. And in our experiment, we used the surface temperature as the ground truth in our mapping experiment. And the surface temperature distribution is shown on the bottom left, where we have the red areas indicating areas of high temperature and the bluer ones indicate low temperature. Beside that, on the bottom left, we can see mapping using our approach. So looking at the grid lines and the different areas that can be seen on the map, we can see that we can focus in a targeted way on high resolution mapping in the high temperature areas and compressing information in the bluer, less interesting areas. In this way, we validate the performance for a computational and memory efficient mapping in a real world scenario. Here's just a short video of showing the same experiment on a different temperature field. So it's accelerated a video showing the simulation environment and a realistic UAV model, essentially doing a lawnmower path, collecting images. And we can see, we can adjust the map resolution based on the values that are observed in from the images from the thermal orthomosaic. So again, we see based on the final structure of the grid map in the video that the high resolution is obtained where we have hotter areas, which is essentially we set as a target for targeted mapping. Okay, so at this point, we saw a lot of content. So before moving on to the next part of the presentation, which is about planning, are there any questions about mapping? I think also Lyrian might be here on the call, so some very technical questions can be also answered. Any questions?
Yeah, I have actually a question. So for the Gaussian process, how do you, as I understand, you model guys model correlations also like spatial correlations, right?
Yeah.
How far can this go? Because you cannot have for your entire map a huge covariance matrix. So can something in one end of the map be correlated to something in the other end of the map, or can you encode this type of information?
Well, I guess it depends on the kernel function, right? So, for example, in the simulated experiment, we look at something like this, which has more or less reasonable length scales. But we haven't looked at like larger environments where things are more smooth. I guess maybe a GPU wouldn't be the right approach here, actually, because we still have this concept of relationship between different variables. So we have to have data that exhibits some kind of spatial pattern, which is where the GPU would be applicable.
Yeah, makes sense.
Any other questions? Okay, saving it for the end. So we can move to the planning part, which naturally builds on from the mapping section, which is how can we use these maps to find the optimal paths for the active sensing mission. So first, how can we define the planning objective in an active sensing application? So our goal here is to collect data in a targeted way. It's not just to move from point A to point B. So how can we figure out where this goal is, where we can collect the most useful information? So here is just a schematic of a robot collecting measurements. And as we said, we have measurements that contain some information value subject to limited operation time that we want to maximize. So we want to make use of the robot's limited budget to maximize the amount of information that we get in the collected measurements. So in literature, this is formalized as the informative path planning problem, which we can see on the slide, which is essentially just telling us in a mathematical way this intuition. And so we want to find a trajectory for the robot to execute that maximizes the expected information gain in the measurement subject to a budget constraint. For example, maximum flight time or maximum energy usage. So in this equation, we have the function I, which quantifies this information objective that we want to maximize, and a measure which obtains discrete measurements along the trajectory, which we can then use to calculate the information gain. In our problem formulation, what's commonly done is normalizing the information gain over the travel time, which allows us to compare the values of trajectories over different time scales. That trajectories that are longer and have more measurements don't have an unfair advantage. So in practice, the core challenge in developing algorithms for planning in such a problem is how can we predict the values of future actions without the robots actually executing them? So to decide which action is best, we also need to be able to evaluate many such actions in a very high dimensional and complex problem space, which can be computationally expensive, especially online and onboard computationally constrained platforms. And our goal is essentially to develop efficient online planning algorithms for these platforms. So in Julia's recent work, we tried to tackle this problem using deep reinforcement learning for the predictive planning and information gathering. So on this slide, we can see the main idea behind the approach. So essentially, we use a convolutional neural network shown here on the left to learn the best policies for gathering new data during a mission. So we want to learn what is the best thing that the robot should do if it finds itself in a given map state and a given position. So we train the neural network using multiple runs in a realistic simulation environment, which we see on the right. So what we do is we simulate many diverse monitoring scenarios with different environments, different initial positions, and we use a Monte Carlo tree search technique to guide the neural network to find the best policies for the robot actions. And essentially this way, we learn to predict where the most measurements with the highest information value are likely to be found. So that when during a mission, if we have a given map state and robot position, we only need a forward pass through the network to calculate the next best action. So that's exactly what this arrow shows. So rather than needing to forward simulate many possible actions using a sensor model and evaluate the information gain over each of them, then find that argmax, we only need a forward pass through the already trained network because we already did the training previously in simulation. So we tried using deep reinforcement learning also for the UAV-based terrain monitoring problem we saw earlier in the presentation. So what do the results look like? We evaluated the approach by comparing it in simulation against different benchmarks. So over here, we compared the reinforcement learning-based approach against the CMAS, which is an evolutionary optimization strategy, a state-of-the-art method from previous work, the Monte Carlo tree search, coverage-based planning using a lawnmower style path, which we saw at the beginning, as a traditional baseline of what is currently being used, and also random motion. On the left plot, we can see how the map uncertainty reduces over time using each of the methods. So the reinforcement learning one is shown in red, and we measure the uncertainty base of the trace of the map covariance. In the middle, then we see the runtime comparison of the different online strategies. So how long it takes each approach to replan. And on the right, we see an example path just for visualization obtained using the reinforcement learning strategy. So looking at the results, we can see that the reinforcement learning approach reduces uncertainty quickest in the problems that were studied, but most importantly, it leads to significant speed-ups for online replanning. And this is because, as we said, the offline train network just needs a single forward pass to generate the next plans, compared to a very computationally expensive search over the entire action space. So also the approach was validated using real-world thermal data, which we saw previously in the video. On the left is the simulation environment, which we built up in Gazebo, showing the field and the UAV. And on the right is the thermal orthomosaic that was collected from a real field close to Bonn. So we developed a planning objective. We defined the planning objective where we want to map the high temperature areas in high detail as quickly as possible. In this setup, we compared how the reinforcement learning-based strategy compares against coverage planning at a fixed altitude as a traditional baseline that is commonly used in practice. And on the plot, we can see the map uncertainty reduction over time is much higher with the reinforcement learning-based strategy because it actually does replanning. So it can adjust the UAV paths to focus on collecting more information in the high temperature regions. In contrast, the coverage strategy has no knowledge of where these areas are, so it covers everything uniformly, which is a limitation of using pre-planned strategies. And on the right, we can see an example path obtained using the reinforcement learning approach and the final map rendered. Once it has explored the field and collected measurements, we can see that the UAV stays to collect more measurements on the high temperature side, where it's redder, as we would expect. And we think that these results are very interesting because they show that the network is able to somehow learn these useful data gathering actions. And we are very excited to explore potential future applications of using reinforcement learning for robot decision-making and accelerating the planning process. So on the next slide, I just want to outline some ideas for actually future work and how we can improve these methods that we just saw. So first, in this talk, we focus on one application, which is the UAV-based terrain monitoring and active sensing. But as you may already appreciate, the methods are quite general. So it would be interesting to explore their applicability for different missions with different objectives. So for example, we have one potential collaboration now where we're discussing how useful is informative planning when we have two different types of sensors, one that has a very high coverage, but low resolution, and one which can do very targeted measurements. So using the rough sensor to measure, to get a rough idea of what is in the field, and then using the targeted sensor to collect, for example, fluorescence information when we have an idea of where the interesting parts are. And another project that I didn't fit in the presentation is we also tried to do planning for collecting useful training data for neural networks. So we defined an active learning objective where we figure out where should the UAV go to collect data that would complement the training set of a neural network better, so that when we retrain it, we can maximize the performance while minimizing the amount of data that needs to be labeled by a human. So we think it's very interesting to explore different potential use cases. And secondly, one important aspect is developing probabilistic models of the robot sensors. And this is important because, as we saw, to make decisions, we need to forecast what will be seen in the future. So we need a way of linking the sensor data to the map while also accounting for this uncertainty. So going back to the example at the beginning of weed detection, we saw that some parts might be incorrectly classified. So can we do some analysis that tells us that our model is uncertain in these regions and use that in the informative path planning framework? A third interesting use case is thinking about applications with multiple robots. So we can think about using different platforms, different actions and sensors. For example, we could have UAV that's spraying crops and another one that is monitoring. And how can we coordinate multiple robots if they're operating on the same field together? And obviously a natural issue that emerges for that is what about scalability? So how can we think about increasing the size of the fields that we want to monitor or any environments, as well as we increase the amount of robots that are operational. And we hope that by addressing these challenges and coming up with new methods, we can increase autonomy in the future robots. So this brings us slowly to the end of the talk. So I just want to wrap everything up with a quick summary. So we started with an introduction about our cluster of excellence as well as a research group. We talked about the active sensing problem using autonomous robots and the key challenges that we need to address to develop an active sensing framework. And then moving from generic to specifics, we outlined some approaches for mapping and planning that enable UAV-based active sensing. And we also saw some key results before looking at future work. So with that, I would like to end the presentation and thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them.
Thanks, Marija. Thanks for a great talk. Yeah, and here comes the Q&A section. Any questions from our audience?
Yeah, I have some more questions. Marija, thanks for the amazing talk. My question is about the way you integrate reinforcement learning in your system. So I haven't worked much with Monte Carlo tree search, but do you have something like a discrete action space in your case, or does it assume a discrete action space, or how is it exactly integrated with in your particular deep learning setting?
Maybe it's a good question to pass to Julius, actually, because he wrote the reinforcement learning framework, so he can give the most details, I think.
Sure, that's actually a very good question. Yes, we do assume a discrete action space. So we discretize the locations based on the map resolution and also assume discrete different altitude levels that a UAV can reach. And this is partially due to how the Monte Carlo tree search works. We combine very similarly to the AlphaZero idea from DeepMind, Monte Carlo tree search and the learned policy that actually steers the Monte Carlo tree search to increase sample efficiency. But the raw version of Monte Carlo tree search assumes discrete action space, and that's why we also needed to discretize the actions. But of course, there are other versions of Monte Carlo tree search where you can integrate continuous action spaces or other reinforcement learning algorithms which directly operate in continuous action spaces. So that would be an interesting thing to investigate next also. But at the moment, yes, it's working on discrete action spaces.
If I may ask a follow-up, so when was there a specific reason why you chose this algorithm over, I don't know, something which would work directly on continuous action spaces, or was it just like for simplicity to get started with something?
Yes, so first for simplicity, but looking at related work of informative path planning, most of the work is sampling-based work, like Masha's previous work or MCTS-based work. And all of them have the same problems, that they are in larger action spaces, like large fields in the end, not that sample efficient. And this AlphaZero is, at least for us, a super straightforward idea to combine more sample efficient exploration by learning offline, and in the end still having the advantage of a sampling-based planner online, which is steered by the deep reinforcement learning policy. Because if the action space is large, just predicting the next argmax of your policy with classical deep reinforcement learning tends to not work that great. So we also still have some exploration component by using the sampling-based MCTS online.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, any other questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask. Yeah, actually, I have a question. So in your informative path planning work, if I didn't miss anything, I think it is focused on thermal map, and that looks straightforward. So I'm wondering if you transfer this methodology to other like width detection, how do you train the network to output the like interestedness of each each area, so that you can like you can output a score for the searching and planning?
So if I understood, it's about how can we define the parts that we want to focus on in the planning algorithm. So basically, that would be within the problem formulation. So basically, that function that you want to optimize, you have to. So for example, if we have a continuous variable, we can threshold values, and then you can look at which parts of the map are above a certain threshold, for example, and you can use that to calculate the information value. So it would be, if that answers the question, it would be encoded in the way that we formulate the problem and the way that we measure information.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that you are using like a neural net to output like the uncertainty. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And like if you use this method like for width detection, instead of thermal map, how do you train that network?
So for example, for the weed application, if I can go on the slide. So basically we trained the network on crop weed segmentation from a data set that we collected actually during my PhD. So it was annotated. Basically it tells us where's the crop and where's the weed. And then we build a map that captures the probability of finding crops and weeds, like a multi-layer map. That's what we did in that work. And then looking at the different layers of the map, if we're only interested in finding the weeds, then we can formulate the information objective that is based on high weed probability given the map. So the network gives the interpretation, but the planning algorithm and the utility function define what we want to focus on. So one can use the same network and simply change the objective function to obtain different behavior, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. That's super clear. Yeah.
Good question.
Any other questions?
I have a more general question. Great talk. First of all, I think this is super exciting. I was wondering, how are you dealing with any unforeseen things happening as you are like using the UAV? I don't know, like I could think about birds or whatever sorts of animals or whatever is happening on the ground that you have not been foreseeing. Like, is there any mitigation measures on what to do in these cases? Or do you just omit this data?
Right now, no. I mean, that's the step from the research to the real application. So when we did some experiments here, I actually have a video, but it was from previous projects. Like a person is standing there watching and ready to take over if something happens. So that's the current state that we're in. But I think it would be super relevant for, I think it's there. It's super relevant for actually deploying these algorithms. So like my supervisor was standing there with a joystick and kind of prepared. So that's kind of the state where we're at.
Thank you.
I have another high-level question, Marija. So I remember in this project, and here I just saw it again, which reminded me of this, is you were collaborating with this ground robot, which I think Bosch or one of their companies deployed. And the ground robot was basically navigating to kill the weeds, and you were basically providing the map. So if you would design the overall system in terms of like application, that would you design it still in the same way where there is the drone for mapping and a ground robot for killing the weed, or would you maybe just build a bigger drone that can also kill the weed, or not build a drone at all and have everything done by the ground robot?
I mean, I think it really depends on the size of the field, actually, because I think for these smaller fields, you can have just the ground robot kind of covering everything, and I think that would be sufficient. But I think where the value of the UAV actually comes in is with bigger fields where they can fly faster and they're much more flexible at deployment. And then we can deploy the UAV to map a field without necessarily going through the navigation of the ground robot, which actually has some negative effects, for example, compacting the soil and things like this. So I think for bigger fields, I think UAVs make a lot of sense, because also they can fly at higher altitudes and they can see more.
And how were the weeds actually distributed in practice? Is it really the case that they're like only in one area a lot, or is it like individual weeds here and there? So
I think we see both. Like what's where there's actually people in our cluster who are researching just that. So how weeds compete with each other when they grow, which is super interesting. So I think that's a great complementary project. So, but what we see here is that they're kind of random, but from time to time you see, as we saw in the picture, like a cluster of weeds together. And that's where this correlation information can actually be useful, because we can say that with the kernel, we can capture the fact that if we saw a weed in one location, probably there are some other weeds growing around it. But yeah, I think this is really interesting because it's very species dependent, actually. So some weeds and plants compete with each other and some cooperate with each other. So they actually do in PhenoRob in the campus where we do these experiments, they plant and then they see what happens basically with different mixtures.
And do you think it will be possible at a fine granularity from a UAV to recognize the particular weed type, not just like how precise can it be if there are multiple weed types? Probably hard, right?
I don't know how this, I think it's possible to have a very good segmentation. Like we also have some colleague who's working on, but it's a super expensive kind of heavy camera that you can mount on a very big drone and then see very detailed things. And then you can actually count the leaves and things like this. But I think for kind of more affordable systems, then you have to use a simpler camera. And I'm not sure also how that works with interspecies. So like if you not just care about whether you see a crop or weed, but you want to actually identify which type that you see. Then you need a very smart network too. I think for weeds, it's also pretty tricky because they're so random. Like the shapes can go in different directions. So it's much easier to segment crops because they have leaves and clearly defined shapes.
Yeah, makes sense.
Any other questions? Yeah, if no other questions, maybe we can end here. It's also about time. Yeah, thanks, Marija. Thanks for the great talk again. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the interesting discussion, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.